Shabbat Shalom. So it's truly my pleasure to invite back Congressman Jake Auchincloss to our bima to speak to us tonight. There's so little going on in the world. I'm sure he just is going to be at a loss of things to say. We're going to ask the congressman to speak to us, and then I will be able to facilitate some questions and answers. And we'll have a little forum here, but then you'll also be able to come up and say hello afterwards as well. And I do want to just emphasize from the announcements that in 2 weeks, that Friday night, the update on Ukraine, and so much of our efforts led by Marlene Bon and David Bone for sending aid to Ukraine. You may remember when the war broke out, we pulled together and we bought an electric generator for the Jewish hospital, and it arrived just in time for then the power got knocked out, and they plugged it in and immediately used it to perform surgeries. So what happens is things fade into the background, but we can't let them. We have to think of all of these things as headlines. So come in 2 weeks for that as well. So welcome to Congressman Auchincloss, serving his third term. It's like it goes by so quickly. Third term, Massachusetts 4th. I understand you also got committee assignments this week. Energy and Commerce Committee. All right, very interesting. Congressman Auchincloss's focus includes healthcare, clean energy, gun violence, and building a strong middle class. He was born and raised in Newton, Massachusetts. He went to Harvard College and then joined the Marines. He commanded infantry in Afghanistan and special operations in Panama, which is back in the news for some reason. Upon returning home, Jake continued his service as a 3-term city councilor in Newton. While working at City Hall on nights and weekends, Jake built a career in business, running product development at both a Fortune 100 insurance company and a cybersecurity startup. He has degrees in economics and finance from Harvard University and MIT Sloan. And today, Jake lives in Newton with his wife, Michelle, and their children, Teddy and Grace and Audrey, who I understand you have put to sleep tonight. Fantastic, as well as their Labrador Retriever, Donut. So welcome back, and we're so delighted that you're with us. And it's no longer the service, we can applaud, right?
Rabbi Meszler, thank you for the kind introduction. I have not forgotten the terms, though. It's the 3rd term I'm going into. I'm aging in dog years down there, so I feel every one of them. President Berman, thank you for coordinating the invitation. Shabbat Shalom. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. I represent 35 cities and towns. Sharon has a special place in my heart. My grandparents are buried here. I feel a close affection to this town, and it's wonderful to be able to speak with you this evening. I'm going into my 5th year as your voice and vote in Washington, D.C. And after 4 years, just as I was beginning to figure out how that place worked, all the rules are going to change because now Donald Trump is back in the White House. And so the question before this Democrat is, how do we respond to this? I do not think the right approach is going to be the outrage Olympics, where everything he says and does, we dial up to a 10 in outrage. I think it's going to desensitize Americans. I think it's going to become a lot of background noise. We have to have a disciplined approach. And so my view is, what can we absolutely not work with this man on and we have to fight him? What are the things where we can work with him on and we have to kind of derive some common ground? And how do we have the discipline to discern between the two and then execute on it? It begins with knowing what we're not going to work with him on and what we are going to fight with him on based on values and priorities. If he tries to federalize the National Guard and launch a mass deportation campaign where they're knocking on people's doors at night, we're not going to work with him on that. That's not who we are as a country. We're not going to intimidate our neighbors. We're not going to make people feel unsafe or unwelcome here in Massachusetts. Individuals who have committed a crime, individuals who otherwise have committed violations are already subject to deportation and detention, but we're not going to do a undifferentiated mass deportation campaign, and we have to make that clear. If he tries to put an anti-vax campaigner at the helm of Health and Human Services, an individual who thinks that there's no such thing as a safe and effective vaccine, despite the fact that vaccines have saved 146 million lives over the last 50 years. We're going to fight him on that. Polio, measles, rubella, these vaccines work. We already have 5 states in this country that are hovering below herd immunity rates for measles, and it is contrary to the Democratic Party's commitment to science and children's health to think that RFK Jr. is going to be allowed to tell Americans that vaccines somehow cause autism or spread other types of ridiculous conspiracy and quackery. So we're going to fight him on that. If he tries to turn the Department of Justice into his own personal law firm and prosecute his perceived enemies, if he tries to politicize the military and undermine 250 years of civilian control of the armed forces, we're going to stand up against that. That's not who we are as a republic. And finally, if he tries to explode the deficit by giving tax cuts to people who don't need tax cuts, we're going to reject that as well. So we have to be clear about where our values and where our priorities are. But there are also areas where we can absolutely work across the aisle. And I did not come to Washington to vote no on things. I came to Washington to try to get to yes. I think we can get yes on fentanyl legislation. Right now, we're losing about 70,000 Americans a year to fentanyl overdoses. And I've introduced 3 pieces of bipartisan fentanyl legislation to interdict the export of fentanyl from the Chinese mainland by sanctioning the Chinese manufacturers of fentanyl, by levying fines for shippers who do not have clear manifests, by creating a joint task force to try to fuse together the different organs of law enforcement to ensure that we are having one command center to crack down on the import. That's a bipartisan issue. We all, in all of our districts, know that there are hundreds and thousands of young people whose lives have been tragically cut short, whose parents could not reach them in their most painful final moments because of the most addictive chemical in human history. On border security, there is common ground as much as it's become a source of campaign fodder. We had a bipartisan border security bill last year. It was probably the toughest border security legislation crafted in my lifetime. It was torpedoed by Donald Trump for political purposes, but the legislation still exists. And if they want to work with us on something that's actually going to create more rationality in our asylum system, that's actually going to be able to prevent states like Massachusetts having to spend $1 billion a year on migrant shelters, of course, we are here to work with them on that. Energy. You wouldn't know it, again, from some of the campaign rhetoric, but in fact, there is areas of bipartisan energy consensus, most particularly on permitting reform. For the first 50 years, environmentalism has been about blocking bad stuff, about preventing single-point pollution in particular into our rivers and into our soil. But in the 21st century, environmentalism needs also to be about building good stuff. We've got to be able to build the clean energy generation and transmission that makes this country clean energy dominant. Geothermal, nuclear power, both fission and fusion. And that requires permitting reform. Can't take 10 or 15 years to build one of these plants. It's just too long. We got to get this stuff built in a couple of years. We got to be able to build the transmission. And no state in the union more needs that than Massachusetts. Folks don't recognize this always, but Massachusetts is in fact really an energy island. We import most of our energy from Trinidad and Tobago in the form of liquefied natural gas, which makes us very susceptible to European spot prices. We need transmission lines from Hydro-Quebec through Maine. We need to be able to build our own energy sources, whether offshore wind or nuclear or geothermal here in the state. We got to build again. And the Republicans have some good ideas on that. They got some pretty bad ideas too, but that's okay. That's why we're here to debate. And then finally, on foreign policy, listen, when he talks about invading Panama, we're not going to do that. But when he makes clear unequivocally that this country is going to be pro-Israel and that we are going to hit hard against Iran, yeah, he's going to have bipartisan support in Congress for that. Over the last year and a half, Joe Biden has been able to architect pretty darn good pro-Israel policy, and he has done so, to be blunt, by ignoring some of the worst ideas from the anti-Israel crew at every single turn. They said, call for unilateral ceasefire on Israel's part. They said, don't hit Hezbollah. They said, hands off Iran. They said, don't let Israel engage in Syria against terrorist groups there. Every single time they were wrong, and Joe Biden was right to ignore them. And now we have Israel in its strongest position at any point since October 7th. Now, we are not there yet. We have 100 human beings still held 450 days into this in terror tunnels underground, including some Americans. But Israel is in a stronger position now than it has been since that horrible day. Iran's own generals are admitting that they lost in Syria and that they are in too weak of a position to strike either American positions or Israeli positions. Lebanon just elected an anti-Hezbollah president after 2 years of stasis. Syria has a new dawn in which its government is clear that it no longer has an appetite to be part of Iran's ring of fire, and Hamas is more isolated than it's ever been in its existence. Now is not the time for the United States to create daylight between it and Israel. Now is not the time for the United States to take its hands off the situation. Now is the time for the United States and Israel to join together and to put Iran even more on its heels. Iran is at its weakest position that it has been in the Ayatollah's lifetime, and we should hit hard. And to the extent that Donald Trump can do so responsibly, he'll have my support. On that note, I would now love to hear from you, your comments, your questions, criticisms, concerns about the 2 years we have ahead of us.
So I'm going to recognize folks, and then I'm going to need to repeat your questions. I'm going to modify a little what you said. We want questions. Not comments. We want questions. Okay. So I don't want comments about different people's op-ed pieces. I do want open-ended questions of learning, please, and I need to repeat them because we have people joining us online, and if I don't say it into a microphone, they can't hear. So I need to be able to repeat them. So, Jeff. So the question was about healthcare. Where do you see common ground? Where do you not see common ground? And what's your position?
That's a great question. It's particularly germane because the committee I was just appointed to, Energy and Commerce, is the committee that has jurisdiction over healthcare. I've been doing a fair bit of work on the issue over the last 4 years, and I now will have the committee of jurisdiction to work on, which I'm excited about. I think on this question, the premise we need to start with is one that is actually not true of most other issue areas, which is that Trump and the Republican Party are actually different. On some issues, they're the same. I mean, he's dominated it. But on this issue, candidly, Trump has no idea about healthcare. He doesn't care. He doesn't think about it. You can hear that when he opens his mouth. Like, no clue. Congressional Republicans have a lot of thoughts about healthcare. And so the question I'm going to answer from you is actually not what I think Trump thinks or not thinks, because I don't think he thinks a lot about it. It's what do I think congressional Republicans want to do. So there are some areas where we can get something done. The most important is on pharmacy benefit manager reform. PBMs, as many of you might know, are the drug pricing middlemen. They're owned by the health insurance corporations. 3 in particular dominate about 70-80% of the market. They're all multi-billion dollars. And they have nestled themselves in the middle of the drug pricing supply chain in between drug makers and pharmacists, and they're making a whole heap of money, and they're doing it by jacking up premiums and copays, particularly through the federal health plans. Both parties have put together some pretty muscular reform. We had it in the end-of-year package, would have saved taxpayers $5 billion and made some important reforms to basically get them closer to fiduciaries. Because right now, they get paid more the higher drug prices go. It's like the worst incentive structure you can imagine. At the last moment, Speaker Johnson, under pressure from the health insurance lobby, he blinked and he took it out. But we're going to get it back in. I actually feel we can get that done. Site-neutral payment reform for hospitals. So this is a little bit more of a complicated issue, but basically, it's going to save taxpayers some money in a way that's actually pretty fair. Now, some of the hospitals are not going to love it, but it's a step towards, I think, a fairer payment system, and I think that we can get that done. The Republicans are going to want to go really hard on Medicaid. I don't think they're going to try to upend the ACA, to your specific question. I think they learned their lesson in term 1. But they're going to try to really gut Medicaid, and we're going to push back pretty hard on that. Medicaid expansion has gotten a lot of kids covered in this country over the last 10 years, and it's been one of the success stories of the Obamacare. And to the extent that they're trying to add in red tape and work requirements and other barriers to healthcare access, I think we're going to push back pretty hard.
All right, then I'm going to go over here. Go ahead, Linda.
For a couple of years, we've seen significant funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to do a lot of important things, including private litigation here in Massachusetts. As an environmentalist who works with other nonprofits, what I'm hearing is everyone's concerned that the money's going to stop flowing, period, or at least stop flowing to Massachusetts. And I keep trying to be optimistic and say, you know, the bill has already been passed, the money's already there, and because Republicans want money to flow to their districts, they're going to also have to allow some money to flow to districts here in Massachusetts, and I'm wondering what you think of that.
That's a tough one to summarize. You've like stumped me. So this is more about future of funding for environmental concerns. So okay.
So the Inflation Reduction Act, which we passed in August of 2022, biggest, boldest climate action and clean energy investment in history, something like $400 billion. I think your political instincts are right, ma'am. The way that bill was structured, and there's one exception, which I'll get to in a second, but broadly, the way that bill was structured is that it was through the tax code. It was investment tax credits and it was production tax credits, which means basically Congress said, we don't know the right way to get to zero carbon technologies. What we do know is if you're doing it, we're going to give you a tax credit. And that unleashed market forces and enterprise in just the right way. So geothermal, solar, offshore wind, nuclear, everybody was eligible. And it's not, again, with a couple of important exceptions, not really a grant program. It's a program that's done through the tax code. So your instincts, I think, are right on in the sense that if you want to get rid of that, you can't do it with a scalpel. You can't be like, I want to hurt Massachusetts and help Oklahoma. Not really. It's you kind of get rid of it. And you know the biggest recipient of all 50 states for these tax credits has been Texas. So I can guarantee you, my Republican colleagues from Texas, they're gonna, they'll thump their chests in public, but privately they're gonna go to Speaker Johnson and say, don't touch this thing. This is good for our home districts. Couple of exceptions. One is the Department of Energy Loan Office. That was a grant. That was a series of basically crowding in private sector investment by de-risking some very, very high risk but high reward clean energy ventures. That's been run very well. And I would be surprised if they get rid of that because it's very market oriented. But the one that I think would be most likely on the chopping block would be the electric vehicle tax, the electric vehicle subsidies, which is a whole separate, frankly, hornet's nest of sort of protectionism versus union politics versus clean energy politics. That's the one that'll be the gnarliest, but I think the tax program will be okay.
Question.
Is there anything that you can do about the growing anti-Semitism, since the war, really? And it does seem like the ultra-liberal Democrats are not on our side.
So the question was, is there anything that you see that can be done about growing anti-Semitism, especially from the far left?
Absolutely. And I do want to, you use the term ultra-liberal. I would adjust that term because, in fact, the anti-Semitism that has festered on the left of the party is not liberal, right? It's, at the core sense of the word liberal, I think has really been destroyed by elements of the hard left in our party, in that they are bringing back some of the darkest excesses of previous eras. But there's absolutely things that we can do. Number one actually is happening today, in that the Supreme Court has just clobbered TikTok's lawyers in oral arguments. TikTok is, I think, one of the most concerning trends of the last several years. And this is a social media platform used by 170 million Americans, including the supermajority of people under the age of 30, the dominant way that they're getting media and information. It is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I want to be very clear about that. It is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you look at the way that algorithm works, anti-American, anti-Israel content is amplified at something like 30x the intensity of pro-Israel, pro-American content. This is, Xi Jinping and the Politburo do not do anything by accident. They are trying to shape the ideological coherence of the next generation of Americans, and it's a darn good investment for them. We do not need to allow that to happen. The arguments that TikTok is making is somehow that this is a free speech argument is nonsense. People can post whatever they want. They can say mean things about me. They can say mean things about Donald Trump. It's all protected under the First Amendment. But freedom of speech is not the same thing as freedom of reach. The CCP does not have a constitutional right to algorithmically amplify certain content that they want and suppress other content that they do not want. We need these dominant media and information platforms to be subject to US law. TikTok, Meta, Twitter, Discord, Reddit, Twitch. These things are the ABCs and NBCs and CBSs of the next generation, and they need to answer to US law, and they need to stop platforming defamation and disinformation, and Congress has a role to play in that. But it starts with making TikTok answer to Congress. That's one important thing that we can do, because I think a large part of what we saw, not the entirety, to be clear, but a lot of what we saw after October 7th was a bunch of people who frankly don't know a lot about the Middle East, who hadn't grown up knowing the context and the history of that region, frankly didn't grow up knowing very many Jewish people. I mean, Jewish people are concentrated in a few places in this country. Most people in most congressional districts just don't know a lot. And all they saw on their TikTok feeds was pictures of babies being killed in Gaza. And if that's all I saw on my feed and I had no knowledge or understanding of what was happening, I'd be mad too, right? And that is exactly the approach taken by TikTok's creators, is that they're trying to amplify outrage and then monetize it. So we've got to rein in that platform and others like it. We also have to make the institutions of higher education in this country uphold their own codes of conduct and adhere to Title VI. And I've taken the lead on this. There's 8 universities in Massachusetts that received a C or lower from the Anti-Defamation League on their campus anti-Semitism climate. I've worked with each of those 8, Harvard and MIT and some others, to ensure that this school year they are in much better shape than they were last school year. Now they got work to do, but I will say to their credit, they have made significant improvements. They are upholding their own codes of conduct. They are cracking down on protests and harassment. They are trying to ensure suitable learning environments. They are preventing targeted discrimination. They have a lot of work to do. I'm not giving them by any means an A, but under threats of investigations, under pressure from members of Congress, under pressure from alumni, we are starting to see changes there. The final element, though, to me, is K-12. And this is the most important element. We need our school committees, we need our principals, we need our superintendents to take seriously their obligation to create learning environments for everybody and to teach facts and history and not allow any faculty members to engage in their own ideological bent. And that's why these local races are so important.
Yes, go ahead.
Something can be done on the college campuses, in particular. These foreign students that come to these schools like Harvard, Ivy League schools, and they're there for the purpose of pro-mass, they're pro-Palestinian, they're there just to create problems and Jewish students can't go to their classes. Now, they're there on foreign scholarships. Can't those scholarships be revoked and they be kicked out of this country? That's one question, okay? My other question is, I know it's freedom of speech, but can we enact a law with burning the American flag, and you as a veteran, and my father was World War II, his father World War I, can be a mandatory 1 year in prison? But my main thing is, that's my thing. And I'm gonna tell you,
I'm going to let him answer your questions. First questions is about people coming into universities, and secondly was about burning the American flag.
So our universities are the jewel in the crown of the Massachusetts economy, and they have made a lot of mistakes in the last couple of years, but accepting foreign students is not one of them. This Commonwealth benefits tremendously from the immigration that we get, and many of the immigrants come through our institutions of higher learning, and they go on to start companies, and they contribute to their local communities. I regret to say that the phenomenon of Jew hate and anti-Israel zealotry is not confined to any one country. We're seeing American students do it too. It has become a ideological posture amongst too many of our youth. I don't think as many of our youth as is portrayed sometimes, but amongst a subset. And our response needs to be demanding that K-12 and higher education get back to the basics of a classically liberal education: critical thinking, civil discourse, understanding and being able to parse facts from opinions. Now, I will say, to the extent that you've got foreign governments or foreign institutions trying to launder money through universities here in the United States, that is something that demands transparency. If the Qataris or the Saudis are funding entire departments and demanding that those departments have an ideological bent, we deserve to know that, and that does need to be put forward. Yeah, I'm a strong defender of the First Amendment. Someone wants to burn the American flag, they have a constitutional right to do that.
Please, John.
Yeah.
What's your prediction about how things might be handled for Dreamers?
Yes, and Dreamers, just for everyone's awareness, is the colloquial term for individuals who came to this country as minors with their parents, who do not have documentation and yet really have never grown up in any other country besides the United States. And documentation and dignity for Dreamers has been a long-time Democratic goal, and one I think that is achievable with bipartisan votes. You're right that the can has been kicked down the road. And, the GOP has a trifecta right now. If you're asking me, do I think that the Dreamers are top of their list of what they want to get done, the answer is no. Is there a chance that we Democrats can insist upon it in exchange for our votes for some kind of a border security policy? The answer is yes, but we've got to go through a few maneuvers first. And the most important is Speaker Johnson is going to spend the next 3 to 6 months figuring out how hard it is to count to 218. He's got 220 votes. I know these folks, I can tell you, they could not get 218 out of 220 to agree what day of the week it is. These folks are not gonna get a big tax, immigration, and energy bill done in the next 6 months. I just don't see it. So he's gonna figure out that this is really hard, and he's gonna probably come to Hakeem Jeffries, hat in hand, and say, I'm gonna need some help. And then Congress begins.
I'm gonna take just a couple more questions, and then you'll be able to also ask privately. Yeah.
This probably sounds sort of milquetoast after everything else, but I'm wondering if something is going to be done about protecting our mail service.
Yeah.
And I say that because there are people in our district who don't get their mail.
I know.
And they're in big cities. They're not like us. We are pretty lucky here, but it's really sad. And we have at least 5 states, and I think there are more now, that only vote by mail, which means if we take that away from them, then of course we're just disenfranchising. So that's my question.
So Susan way underrepresents herself by calling her question milquetoast, and I've got to push back on that. It's not milquetoast at all. All politics is local, and she's asking about mail deliveries and people who don't get their mail, especially how it affects mail-in ballots and voting, and we have a problem here in Massachusetts.
We do. No, I agree with you, Rabbi. It's actually a critical question, and one that consumes a fair bit of our time. The mail service has not been acceptable. It hasn't been acceptable in several parts of my district, and we've been taking the postmaster to task for it. We've had a new postmaster now because it was really not doing what it needed to be doing, and it's gotten somewhat better, but you're right that it's not sufficiently reliable. It tends to get worse in the late summer, and it tends to get worse around Christmas time, and then it tends to get a little bit better again the first half of the year. A lot of times, at the core of it, I believe, is 2 things. One, they're implementing basically a new operating system for how they sort and deliver the mail. And I don't claim to be an expert on it, but it's new machinery and it's new facilities, and there's some sort of growing pains with it, and I'm sort of agnostic as to whether it's a good idea or not, but they clearly need to execute better on that. The second is recruiting. They can't hire enough mail carriers. They're having a really hard time with that. And I don't know that we have seen a good enough recruitment and retention plan from the U.S. Postal Service. I've always been strongly committed to funding it at the levels necessary to pay these postal carriers a good wage. It's a hard job. And it's a good job, an important job. And so to the extent that it needs funding to do a good job, I will be there to support the funding, but I'm also going to demand that they improve their performance.
Second to last question, and then I'm going to get the last question. I'm going to go for Paul. Paul's been waiting. Thank you.
I'm happy to take a few more.
Okay. All right. We'll take a few more, he says. Okay.
Is your name on any legislation before Congress this year?
Is your name on any legislation before Congress this year?
Sure, yeah.
Which bills?
Which ones?
The one a few, but the ones that I'm most excited to introduce is HR 9096, which is Pharmacists Fight Back. That's a bill to rein in the middlemen of drug pricing and to lower copays and premiums, really crack down on the insurance companies. The other big one, apropos of our commentary about social media, is a bill to puncture the Section 230 shield that our social media corporations have enjoyed since the 1990s. Basically, in the 1990s, Congress decided that the social media, they weren't social media companies then, internet service providers and interactive computer services, technically, could not be sued for third-party content. If you had a recipe blog and somebody commented on your recipe blog and said something nasty or defamatory, you couldn't be sued for that. And in the 1990s, that was actually a really good idea. And that law has been called the 26 words that gave birth to the internet, because it created this liability shield where entrepreneurs could build stuff. Great. Well, it's 30 years later, and the internet has changed. And these companies are not scrappy recipe blogs. They're trillion-dollar corporations who have hundreds of thousands of engineers, and they need to be better corporate citizens. They need to clean up the toxicity on their platforms. One example of that is deepfake intimate privacy violations. These are videos that can be generated from photographs, and bluntly, it's all non-consensual deepfake pornography targeting women, and it is spreading on these social media platforms, and they have no liability for it. It's not their problem. It's illegal, but it's not their problem. This is the kind of stuff that spreads when boards of directors and CEOs don't have to care, and we got to make them care. And I got legislation to do that. It's bipartisan. Big tech hates it, so we'll see how successful it is with Elon Musk as the co-president. But we're gonna work it.
Sherry, you had your hand.
Yeah, quick question. So I think one of the biggest issues affecting us down here is the closure of Norwood Hospital. Your colleague Stephen Lynchburn that read it last week to discuss what he's going to do to possibly reopen Norwood or get some kind of a substitute. What do you think our situation looks like in the next 12 to 18 months?
So Sherry was asking about the closure of Norwood Hospital and how that's affected us here in this district, and what do you think is coming in the coming months?
I don't know is the candid answer, because 97% of this is at the state level. Really, the legislation, the enforcement, the regulation is all state level. It's all Kate Walsh and Governor Healy. I certainly understand that since the closure of the hospital, because of the disaster, that there has been a harder time for access. It's one of the reasons why I supported, along with our two senators, expansion of Sturdy in Attleboro, which I understand is, obviously not directly in the catchment area for Sharon, but it does take some of the pressure off some of the towns in between when it comes to routing emergency services. And we've also been able to stabilize in South Coast the two hospitals that were owned by Steward. We've gotten them helped get them new ownership and ensured that they'll be able to provide. So although we have the lacuna here, I think we've been able to shore up access elsewhere, so at least we don't have incoming.
A question, yes.
First of all, Congressman, thank you for coming. Pleasure. So, what leverage does Congress have with the Supreme Court if the Constitution and precedents come into threat?
Say that again? What leverage does Congress have over the Supreme Court for any decision that, in terms of constitutionality?
So, I mean, it's obviously a very vexed question. To a certain extent, the answer is not much by design, right? With the separation of powers, the framers did not want us to have sort of near-term direct leverage over the Supreme Court, so we have checks and balances. There are obviously things that we can do. So one, on questions of political import, the Supreme Court tends to defer to the two political branches. And actually, again, today's hearing is a great example of that. When Congress and the president say, hey, we think TikTok's a real problem, and we can show you why this is not a First Amendment issue because people can still post what they want, it just has to be under US ownership, the Supreme Court, I'm almost positive, is going to defer to the two political branches. By the way, that would have been, I think, true also if we had filed a 14th Amendment and passed a 14th Amendment resolution about Donald Trump after the insurrection on January 6, 2021. If instead of impeachment if we had said prospectively he violated the insurrection clause, I think the Supreme Court would have upheld that he couldn't run again, but that's in the rearview mirror now. The other thing, sort of the nuclear option, is the Congress could expand the court. I mean, that's the other thing. So expand the court or put in 18-year term limits through a system of cycling the judges. The Constitution says that judges have lifetime appointment, but they don't say that the lifetime appointment has to be on that bench, so they can go into senior status. So Congress could say, hey, you've got 18-year term limits on the Supreme Court, or we're making it 13 instead of 9 or something like that. 9 to 13, I'm not there yet on that idea. Not convinced that wouldn't just unleash this ratcheting effect where every single party would expand the court every time they got a majority in Congress. I think that would be very unhealthy. But 18-year term limits I do support. I think that way it's nice and clean. Every president gets 2, and it feels more fair.
I'm going to go 1 and 2, and then we're going to wrap up. Jay? The question is about gun legislation, and what do you think, because the majority of Americans are in support, what do you think the chances are movement on this issue?
Heartbreakingly, I would say 0, to be blunt with you. I wish I were not right about that, but I'm trying to imagine a world in which Speaker Johnson bucks the NRA. I just don't see it. They will not even let him bring something to the floor. I'm trying to protect resourcing for the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau so that they can enforce against ghost guns. And there's a lot of things I want to do on guns, assault weapons and safe storage laws and universal background checks and red flag laws. We're not going to get any of it with Speaker Johnson. But my goodness, ghost guns should be something that we can at least get them to give money to the ATF for. It's already illegal. And yet the Republicans seem to think that it's not a problem that people can buy weapons that will pass through a metal detector undetected. They're fine with that. We're going to fight for that, especially because it affects Massachusetts. The problem, Massachusetts has great gun laws, but ghost guns undermine all of our gun laws because they're undetectable. They're not unserialized. So that to me is like this narrow vein of the imperative that we have under the GOP trifecta. And then of course, I'll just flag for everybody, we've got to support the gun law that Massachusetts passed. It's going to come under a referendum vote in 2026 to overturn it. And this was a really, really good piece of legislation at the state level that puts in place a bunch of good reforms around assault weapons and around ghost guns, and we got to protect that.
Last question, Greg. Or second to last. I'm going to ask the last question. I'm the rabbi. I'm going to let this be the last question because it's very similar to the one I was going to ask. So I'm going to take mine off the table. You've been in this role now. You're going into your 5th year. Is the system still working? I say this like as a matter for Jewish values. We have disputes. We have debates. We do so l'shem shamayim. There are disputes for good causes, and then there's useless disputes. And is the system still working, and what would you change about it? And that's a great way to end. And I just add that in my experience, especially with people within my congregation, Of course, there are disagreements, but when you get down and you actually talk to people and you focus on rational problem solving, you discover that people often agree at 80% of the time or something like that, if you're willing to maybe dial down the rhetoric and some of the emotion and just come together. So what are your thoughts?
More important than my thoughts are the thoughts of those who can vote with their feet. Over the last 4 years, 8 million people walked across a continent to come and live in this country without any guarantee of protections or job security, just because they thought this system was working better than any system that they were born into. And I think that's a powerful vote of confidence that of all the countries in the world, America still is the one with the best ideas, and the core idea being that the circumstances of your birth should not determine the condition of your life. And we try to architect an economy and a government that manifests that. And we look at our biggest competitors, China in particular, they can't hold on to their best and brightest. They can't hold on to their people. People are trying to get the heck out of there. And I think that is a powerful testament, more compelling than anything I could say about whether I think the system is working or not. What I see up close is that we spend too much time thinking about the individuals within the Beltway and not enough time thinking about the incentives that dictate their behavior. Humans are humans broadly, and they're going to follow their incentives. And the truth is the incentives for members of Congress and for most politicians is to worry about their primary rather than their general election. In Congress, in the lower chamber, there's 435 representatives. 400 of them aren't going to face a competitive general election. They're going to face a competitive primary. And what does that mean? That means that they're going to orient towards their flanks. About 20% of voters show up to a primary, and they're the most ideologically intense voters. And that it's centrifugal for our politics. It pulls people to the flanks, and it creates an incentive for most members to have to orient away from the median voter. We can fix that. We can't fix it in Congress. I think people sometimes get this confused. All of this election laws are state, but what Alaska has done with Final Five voting, what New Jersey has done with gerrymandering, what Maine is trying to do with limiting money to super PACs, those three things are a very powerful set of ingredients to combine, not to actually change a whole lot about our culture as Americans, because to the rabbi's point, I think 70% of Americans are huddled between the 40-yard lines of American politics. It's not to change them. It's just to insist that politicians actually orient themselves to them and are receptive to them. And I'd like to be hopeful that over the next decade, we'll start to see those electoral forums come into being so that Congress can start to speak more like the American people do.
I want to say a big thank you to Congressman Auchincloss. It's important to be able to have opportunities and forums like this, and we're glad that you were able to come to us. And I know people are going to be able to ask individualized questions and to be able to come forward to speak to Congressman Auchincloss. And thank you very much for being here. And I want to say Shabbat Shalom to everybody. And Cantor, I think that what we're going to do, we're going to take a pause. So Congressman, you can go have a seat. We're going to finish off with Kiddush right in here, because I don't think we're going to fit. I don't need to do this. We're not going to fit in the lobby.